Hello, Mzansi. You are listening to the world's best podcast presented by WAN EFRA Digital Media Awards, Food for Mzansi's Farmers Inside Track podcast. I am your host, Patricia Tembo. Welcome to episode 436. Today we're discussing agroecology and its relevance for South African farmers. This episode is set to be informative as we are joined by Professor Kingsley Ayisi, agroecologist and director of the Center of Global Change at the University of Limpopo. Prof, thank you so much for joining us on Farmers Inside Track. You are the director of the Risk and Vulnerability Science Center at the University of Limpopo, but would you please tell us a little bit more about yourself and your scope of work?
Okay, no, our name has changed recently. It's now called Center for Global Change. And agroecologist by profession and also agronomist. And the center deals with issues of global dimension, which includes food security, water security, waste, climate change, and the whole aspects of global change. So for this interview, I think we are working in the issue of agroecosystems and agroecology. I've been in the field for several years. I've trained a lot of students, and we're trying to also get more students to be climate smart in their thinking and in their approach and their contribution to society.
We're very grateful to have you share your knowledge about agroecosystems and agroecology for farmers who are listening to familiarize themselves with the term agroecology. Can you just explain what it is and why it is relevant for South African farmers?
Agroecology has been defined clearly by the Food and Agricultural Organizations of the United Nations. It says it's an integrated approach. It's a key word, the integrated approach that simultaneously applies ecological and social concepts and principles to the design and management of food and agricultural systems. So the key words there is integrated approach, ecological approach, and social concepts.
It encompasses that there's a social aspect as well as an ecological aspect, and those two are not mutually exclusive of each other.
Exactly.
How does agroecology then differ from other methods of sustainable agriculture, like conservation agriculture? Is it the same thing, or is there a differentiation?
There are quite a number of overlaps. Agroecologically has a specific emphasis in the approach to implementing the principles of agroecology in farming. And the key one is that it is based on bottom-up and localized processes, helping to deliver solutions to local problems. So if I may to expand on that, it is not prescriptive. You engage the beneficiaries that you are targeting. So they play a key role, understand their challenges, and then in finding solutions through technology, they play a very key role. And it's also quite localized. So you cannot generalize on a larger scale because of the differences in agroecosystems. So that is how it differs. But conservation agriculture applies some of those principles. Sustainable agriculture applies those principles. But in the past, it's been more of the bottom approach.
You mentioned agroecosystems earlier, and I understand that it is important for a farmer to understand the agroecosystem that they are working with on their farm, because it does differ from the different zones, agroecological zones. Can you expand a bit more on that? Because some farmers may not be actually aware of the ecological systems that are happening on their farm, or perhaps overlook that in their production and cultivation practices.
No, the agroecosystem is, you are looking at mainly a managed system. We have the natural ecosystem, which is your wild areas. The moment you decide to manage the production of agriculture, crops or animals, you already transit into the agroecosystem. So the emphasis in agroecosystem is more on the food production. But then there are differences. We have deviated from the original practices where our forefathers used to practice. Now we have a agroecosystem that can be purely monoculture, one crop and that's it. And this is where the agroecological principles that we are promoting comes in, trying to deviate from single or less species interaction and trying to bring a lot of diversity in still producing the food that we need. And there are reasons why agriculture has transformed from those days. So always the pressure to feed the teeming human population, but all this comes also at the expense of the environment. So in agroecosystems, we're trying to promote utilizing local systems to improve ecosystem services and also minimize the input of external resources. That's the bottom line at this stage.
You did mention indigenous knowledge and how we've moved away from that. Would you encourage farmers to go back to the indigenous knowledge that they have or that has been passed to them that they perhaps have forgone in trying to keep up with the global markets and cultivation practices? Do you think there's still a place for indigenous knowledge in farming?
Yes, definitely. Now, as we said that we are looking at bottom-up approach to producing food. At this stage, you are empowering the local community. So the indigenous knowledge play a key role here. They farm over the years and sometimes they know the local context, the key issues. And if you don't understand some of these things, our effort as researchers might not yield the fruit that we are looking for. So to answer your question, indigenous knowledge is very important and we need to understand. It doesn't mean that everything that they will say will work, but we need to really understand that and try as much as possible to incorporate into our food systems.
What are some of the studies that you've done or your research team has done in South Africa that shows agroecology to be a viable approach here in South Africa? If you can share some of the studies that you've done.
There are key principles that guided our studies in terms of agroecology. We're trying to empower community whilst we are developing technology to address the problems. There are key things that we want to increase diversity in the agricultural fields. An example could be your intercropping systems, where instead of sole cultures, let's say, if you want maize, you are producing only maize on large scales of land. Rather than that, you try to incorporate other crops that are complementary to enhance productivity. And that's intercropping, can be maize and legume crops. And also agroforestry, we are keen on that. When we talk about agroforestry, we're looking at woody perennial species at the farm level. So we have farmers where they are producing vegetables and maize, and more recently, we've also incorporated 500 seedlings of lemon. These are perennials along the boundaries of their farms. So it doesn't really interfere with their normal operation, but that could be another source of income from them. It's an integrated system. And we also study how the presence of a woody perennial species helps to boost the production of the main crops that they have been doing. So we do studies in that. Also cover cropping. We have this leguminous crop that can tap atmospheric nitrogen in the soil. So sometimes instead of leaving the land fallow to wait for the next season, we start planting some cover crops. With the cover crops, the soil is not exposed, so you help to minimize erosion. You help to improve the soil fertility and the soil health. We're also doing things like crop rotation so that you rotate. These are all systems that we don't continue to produce a similar crop on the same piece of land. We change from season to season. We're doing things like vermicomposting, where we're using earthworms to degrade organic matter that becomes a good source of nutrient for your crop. So you minimize the input of chemical or inorganic fertilizers. So these are a whole lot of things that we do. And we do this with farmers generally. We have both at the experimental farm to generate the scientific information we need. And then simultaneously we work with the farmers so that they can recommend the best feasible practice that they can adopt.
That was very insightful information. Thank you. With the farmers that you work with on the experimental farm, but I believe you also work on farmers who are working or who are producing independently, how did they transition into adopting agroecological principles? Was it a difficult transition?
It's not been easy. I mean, when we started, they always look at it as a university project. And that's what we are trying to avoid. But we also work with the provincial departments who are very helpful. They understand the principles, and it makes it easier to get the farmers' attention and their cooperation. This is an ongoing process. We've learned it's difficult because we realized that we could develop technologies in the past in the farming communities, but when you are not there, then it's not adopted. But now we're making a determined effort to work with them closely. And some of them are already practicing it, so that's encouraging.
In a recent interview, we spoke to Dr. Nzebele from the Agricultural Research Council, and he was talking about his study on indigenous vegetables and the increase in nitrogen availability. And it's something that they're trying to get farmers to adopt into their practices. I think you mentioned as well that intercropping is, something that's very useful and beneficial. Just to speak more about indigenous crop, what knowledge can you give to the farmers? You also encourage indigenous vegetables, or are they more of an invasive or alien species or weeds? Some farmers see indigenous vegetables as a weed, like in the amaranth species. So can you maybe give your thoughts on that, on indigenous vegetables or crop?
We had one student who did his PhD on that, and that is also important. The advantage of indigenous crops is that they are adapted to the area, so they tend to withstand this climate variability and change much better. We also have to know the reason why you are producing that. Is it for food security? You need to define it. If it's something that is widespread in the local community, it's easier for farmers to accept it. While meeting, there was this issue of the young generation not wanting to eat those foods. So some other indigenous species can also be commercialized. You have a group of farmers who want to really move from just producing it for food, but to actually make an income from it. So it plays a big role, but you need to know your target farmer that you have to work with and promote that crop. If we don't do it, we might lose it, most of them, for good.
Do you think that we will see agroecological policies being developed by the Department of Agriculture? Do you think it's still far off, or do you think that there will be policies that, take researchers like yourself are doing and, implement in the policies? Because you did say it is a bottom-up approach.
Yes, and bottom-up approach and co-generation of information. That's the emphasis I made, that it shouldn't be one-sided from the researchers. But definitely, yes, government is keen on agroecological principles. I think the climate smart agriculture documents are out already. That's a good sign from the government. And there are all kinds of efforts to promote this across the different provinces. So I believe that the trigger will be continue researching, continue working with farmers and generate success stories, And these days, if the principle works, and then we have some key stories, success stories, it becomes easier for others to adopt. And also with the changes in climate, some areas we might be forced to go that route. Because if you depend on mainly external inputs, and those become expensive for your soil and all the environmental issues, it might not be sustainable in future. So that's why this is probably the right time to put emphasis and promote agroecological systems and practices in our food systems.
Thank you so much to Professor Kingsley Ayisi, agroecologist and director of the Center of Global Change at the University of Limpopo. For more info on the topic, please visit www.foodformzansi.co.za. And that's a wrap. Remember to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platforms. From me, Patricia Tembo, our technical producer, Megan van der Vent, and the rest of #Team Food for Mzansi. Thank you for listening.
Life in South Africa can be a lot. I mean, scroll through Twitter for a minute and tell me I'm wrong. Thank God for South Africans though, right? We're inspiring, and even on the bad days, we fight back with a smile. That's why I love Food for Mzansi so much. We're not ashamed to celebrate the ordinary unsung heroes who work every day to put food on our nation's tables. Go to foodformzansi.co.za and never miss an inspiring story.